Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. If you're new to The Authority File, you can listen to and find previous episodes on all of the major podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, and on our website, choice360.org. My guest for this series is Michelle Porter. Michelle is an author, poet, and postdoc fellow at the University of Toronto, where she's pursuing a unique blending of her research and creative output. Her book, due out this month from Wilfrid Laurier University Press, is called Scratching River. It's a memoir that's part poetry and part nonfiction, but it's all based on family, one's sense of place, and on Michelle's Métis ancestry, a First Nations group of mixed European and Indigenous roots. In this series, which is provided with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press, Michelle and I discuss her research background and the process of writing her book, Scratching River. In this final episode of the series, we discuss the unique ways in which Michelle structured her book, including the use of experimental storytelling, the relationship of the physical landscape to her writing, and how she constructed one of the most interesting bibliographies I've ever seen. You've touched on this throughout our conversations here, but I'm wondering if you could more specifically speak to how you've worked the sort of Métis way into your storytelling in this book. And I'm thinking of sort of experimental storytelling, following a musical tradition, and you mentioned your crooked quote unquote approach to this, and that I'm assuming relates to crooked music. So I'm wondering if you can kind of talk a little bit about those elements.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna the crooked music, of course the music and dance. What was the other thing you mentioned? I know I've already.
The experimental aspects of the
Oh yes,
experimental storytelling. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, part of Scratching River really very much based on the river and the braiding river, but it's also equally based on musical structures. The crooked Métis musical structure, which appears in much of the fiddle music, the traditional fiddle music. So, if you take the Red River Jig, for example, every Métis fiddler would improvise bits at part. The crooked music is when when at every playing, the phrases will be played with. You can add a beat, you can drop a beat, and it's improvised with each telling. Now, when you're writing something that's going to be the same on a piece of paper for the rest of the time, how do you represent that?
Yeah.
So I built into this crooked music ethic into each chapter by pulling together each of the elements, but deliberately weighting them differently and almost improvising their braiding or their interactions or their phrasing on the page. Now, I'm not a musician, so I am using all of my musical terms loosely, and my understanding of music comes just very much as doing some basic research into understanding it, but also listening to it, experiencing it. But in traditional music and in traditional academia, when you're writing a book, first they like to see every chapter the same length. They like to see every section having, they like to know what to expect. I deliberately did not do that in mirroring, echoing, offering up what I would consider a crooked writing style
Okay.
that plays with different rhythms and beats and different elements while playing with some of the same elements. So there's the also the particularly in the Red River Jig, you will find that there's places where you can play the traditional, you can play it exactly as it was always played, and then there's a space for a new way of playing or to demonstrate your own skill with the fiddle or just something new that or a new kind of music. Same with dance, that when this signal in the music, this turn happened. You go from doing the traditional steps to, I mean, people do all sorts of styles of dance that you would see, in any dance club
Right.
today. So it gives room for the old generations and for the stability of tradition, but also for the next generation. So built into these traditions is an understanding of the future, that we need to make room for the future. We need to make room for the next generation of creators, next generation of knowledge, and
Hmm.
and how and how that will shift both the music, but who we are and how we think of ourselves. So that's also that improvisational part is part of that experimental storytelling that I decided to do. That's my contribution, sort of to looking at, how am I doing this in my way now, putting together these poetic, many of these poetic bits and these this folk tale and the news stories combined so many of my own experiences and so many things I've encountered in my life, and allowed me to bring it into a story that brings the past, the present, and the future together. And again, I've put them together to resonate, so that because every reader can take something slightly different from it, or can take their own a different meaning from it, that allows for future readers
Hmm.
to build into it future content.
Excellent. So I related to that, I'm wondering, you mentioned sort of working in making sure sort of there's an understanding of the future. So I'm wondering how that relates to how you integrated your Métis ancestry and history with a more contemporary storytelling about you and your immediate family. Sort of, I mean, earlier in our conversation, you talked about how just the way you and your family, your mom and your siblings traveled. A lot when you were younger, sort of paralleled the travels of your ancestry. And what are some of the other ways you've sort of merged the traditional and the contemporary in your writing?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, so the spark of this book was this sense that although we're living in different times, encountering Louis Goulet's memoir, Vanishing History,
Hmm.
and recounting what it, that feeling of traveling across the prairie homeland, that we're living in different times, that core of traveling, that traveling to make our lives work, that traveling um, to aunties and uncles, and to homeland, and to fiddling competitions, to all of those things remains. There are many modern reasons we're doing all of this, and yet that travel as a way of life, mobility as a way of life, continued. I mean, my mother just had the impulse to travel, and I've read a variety of books of many indigenous people who speak of actually having a parent, often a mother, who has that similar impulse to move on all the time. I went to 15 different schools up to grade 12, and while moving across, majority prairie homeland, a little bit of BC, and in many ways, travel has always been related very much to, actually, we might want to call it economic today, but the bison
Hmm.
were core economic, food survival, and that's also why we're doing it today. But we're in cars instead of the Red River cart, or on
Right.
foot. I mean, actually, we walked almost. I'm still walking all the time everywhere, and so we take that past of, we traveled, we're still doing that today. What can we, based on this, if this is who we are as a people, if this is who we are, how do we take that and point it into the future that we want? And what is the future that we want? Um, that is one of the considerations here. That's what I tell the story, the bison, with it alongside the story of the river, and that's part of that focus. A river can jump over bison. We're almost totally gone from the prairies altogether are coming back, and there's a possibility for a renewed relationship with that animal, and with a new understanding of what that kind of mobility can mean and how that can impact how we live in the future. Now, in some ways we're far away from that future, but in other ways, until we point ourselves there, we won't be there. But in this book, there's telling a lot through also that use of that tale. So that's a big tradition in all Indigenous, but also in Métis, that telling of what would seem to be, in folklore you might call it a folk tale, but a fictional tale, but that has all the elements of the truth in it. And so
Mm.
I have that story weaving through each chapter to keep that tradition of, you might start a story saying, this is a true story. And, another story you'd say isn't true. And yet they each carry their own truth. So that's why you do get the mixing of academic truths, of conversational family truths, of and that folk tale truth as well.
Right. Excellent. So you've and I didn't want to let this question go with especially for our audience of listeners. You've built a fascinating bibliography for Scratching River, and I think this now that we've had this conversation, I understand this so much better now. It's full of so many creative elements, and you've essentially kind of broken through the confines of academic research, so to speak. And I'm wondering if you can, in the way you've built the bibliography, and I'm wondering if you can explain your views on bibliographies and how you've addressed those with this one in Scratching River.
Okay, can I start out by being honest that putting together a bibliography makes me want to cry?
Yeah, I don't blame you at all. Yeah.
um, I think because so much of the engagement I love is creative, that set style, there we go. A bibliography to me leaves no room for freedom, no room for
Mm,
improvisation, no room for experimental storytelling, and I just vibrate against the confines of it.
yeah.
Um, so just as who I am, I find it difficult. But there's other reasons that I bring to it, and maybe this is another example of that idea of the how I bring elements of the past and the present and the future together in parts of this book. So this bibliography, I rebelled against. I resisted at first. I said, "Do I need one?"
Right.
And so but when I sat down to say yes, of course, I need to recognize so many of the different people, work, research, ways of knowing that came into it. I realized that part of my part of what I disliked about the bibliography is that it leaves out so much more
Mm,
that I could say, and it felt so partial and so, in some ways, the traditional bibliography, when you're working within the Métis context, where the only people I was going to be able to thank openly or to recognize how they contributed to my base of knowledge were going to be other academics.
mm,
That felt so wrong because this book was built even much more so on my mother's knowledge, my grandmother's knowledge, my grandfather's knowledge, the knowledge that my brother taught me, somebody whose way of teaching and being would never be recognized in a traditional academic bibliography.
mhm.
And so there's also the risk of just, I suppose, the risk of it being unfinished all the time, that I am going to read so many more things that will continue to inform how I think of this book and how I think of all the things in this book.
Right.
That I didn't want to say these are my sources and that's that. I felt like this book, like the river, continues to flow, and its meanings within me continue to flow. And I wanted to write a bibliography that somehow um, started to get at that idea of how incomplete and unfinished for me in this work, a bibliography was going to be. And I braided in some of the poetry, some of the ways of thinking about rivers, and I recognized places I've lived, land, um, different people I've talked to who've really shaped the way that I've thought, including my mother, my auntie in BC, a cousin, all of those uh, people appear in it. And Métis academics who some I've met, some whose work I've just read, other writers. All of this really makes it possible for me to have written this book.
Hmm.
Makes it possible for me to, continue down the path that I'm walking. It's not just my path, and it's not just the path of academics. It's a much richer path that includes so much history and so much of what will happen in the future as well.
Right. Excellent. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for your time and for joining us on this program.
It's been such a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you for having me.
You just heard from Michelle Porter, an author, poet, and postdoc fellow at the University of Toronto. Michelle's first book of poetry, Inquiries, was shortlisted for the Pat Lowther Memorial Award in 2019 and was a finalist for the E.J. Pratt Poetry Award in 2021. Her memoir, Scratching River, is due out this month from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. The series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.